Hey, my name is Cal Merritt. I'm 31 years old, and I live in a small rental house on the east edge of Harlan, Kentucky, about a quarter-mile from the rail yard where I've worked for the last 6 years. I'm a maintenance coordinator for the freight line. What that means, practically, is that I walk the yard every morning with a clipboard and a flashlight and look for everything that shouldn't be there. Rust on coupling pins, split ties, wear in the rail joints, cracks that a loaded car would widen by morning. I find what's failing before it fails. That's the job. People don't think much about it, and I've never needed them to. The yard is moving or it isn't. The cars are safe or they aren't. I know the difference, and that's enough. My mornings start at 5:15. I'm on the yard by 5:45, coffee in a thermos, boots already laced. I walk about 4 miles before most people have turned off their alarms. I come home around 3, eat whatever I put together the night before, and sit on the back step for a while before I go inside. On weekends, I do the same walk I always do, through the south end of Harlan, up past the old high school, through the corner of the park on Clover Street, and back around by the rail yard fence. It takes about 40 minutes. I've walked it so many times, I don't have to think about where my feet go. My phone doesn't ring much. I've got my mother in Hazard, my buddy Deke who works dispatch, and maybe 3 other numbers I answer without checking who it is. That's not a complaint. I'm not lonely in some way I'd want to talk about at a dinner table. I've just been by myself long enough that it has a shape I recognize. There was a woman, about 4 years back. Her name was Claire. We were together 2 years. And then she got a position in Columbus and I didn't, and we said we'd figure it out. And then we didn't figure it out. And then one October she stopped calling as much, and by December I was the only one still trying. I let it go eventually. I'm not sure I ever decided to. It just ran out of momentum and stopped moving. I'm okay. That's the truest thing I can tell you about where I was before any of this happened. I was okay. The yard was running. The walks were good. The back step was quiet. I was okay. The Saturday it started was the 3rd week of April. The dogwoods were just coming out along Clover Street, which is the best they ever look, still white, not yet gone brown at the edges. I came through the park the way I always do, on the gravel path that curves around the little pond, and I wasn't thinking about anything much. I was watching a pair of mallards work their way around the near bank. There was a woman on the bench at the curve of the path, maybe 25 feet ahead of me. I noticed her the way you notice anything new on a walk you've taken 300 times, just as information, nothing more. She had a diaper bag open on the bench beside her and a stroller in front of her, and she was on her phone. And something about the way she was holding the phone, pressed hard to her ear, free hand flat on her knee, told me the call was not a good one. The baby in the stroller had been quiet. As I got level with the bench, he stopped being quiet. He didn't cry hard. It was a working up to it sound, the kind that starts in the chest before it gets to the throat. The woman looked down, looked back up at nothing in particular, pressed the phone harder to her ear. She said, quietly, I know. I'm listening. I stopped walking. I almost didn't. I had my thermos and my 40-minute route, and I hadn't had anything asked of me yet that morning. And I am a person who values a morning that runs the way it's supposed to run. I stood there on the gravel for a second, watching her trying to hold the call together, and I thought, this is not your situation. Keep moving. Then, the baby really started crying, and she closed her eyes for just a second, and I watched something pull tight across her shoulders like she was bracing herself. I walked over to the stroller. She looked up at me. She had brown hair falling out of whatever she'd pinned it up into, and she was wearing an old gray sweatshirt over a pair of jeans, and her eyes were very dark and a little red at the edges, and there was a look on her face that I recognized from men I've known who've been holding something together for too long. That look. Not dramatic, not asking for anything, just holding. I said, quietly enough not to interrupt her call, "You want me to take him for a minute?" She looked at me for about 2 seconds longer than was comfortable. Then she said, "He doesn't usually go to strangers." I said, "Okay." I waited. She looked at the stroller and then back at me, and something in the calculation she was doing shifted, and she said into the phone, "Hold on 1 second." And then she leaned forward and unbuckled the baby from the stroller and held him out to me. He was maybe 8 or 9 months old. Round face, a little flushed, wearing a blue onesie with a duck on it. I took him. He stopped crying in about 45 seconds. Not because of anything I did, exactly. I just held him flat along my forearm with his head in the crook of my elbow. The way I remembered from when my nephew was this size. And I walked a slow circle around the bench, and he looked up at the dogwood trees and forgot what he had been upset about. The woman watched me over her shoulder while she finished the call. She spoke for maybe 3 more minutes. Short answers. A lot of yes. And then I understand. And then I'll call you back this afternoon. Then she put the phone in her lap and sat there for a second with both hands open on her knees, not doing anything. I walked 1 more slow circle and came back around to the bench. She said he really did stop. I said, "Trees help." He was looking at the trees. She reached for him. I transferred him back, and he made a small sound of protest and then settled against her shoulder. She said, "I'm sorry, I didn't even ask your name." I said, "Cal." She said, "I'm Nora." And then, like she remembered something, she tilted the baby slightly toward me and said, "This is Henry." I said hello to Henry. He was not impressed. She looked down at him for a second and then back up at me. She said, "I'm sorry about that. The call. It was my landlord. I've been trying to get him to fix the heat in our unit since February, and it's a whole thing." I said, "February's a bad month to not have heat." She said, "It really is." There was a small silence. The mallards had moved around to the far bank. I said I should let her get on with her morning. She said, "Yes, sorry, thank you." I picked up my thermos from the path where I'd set it down and kept walking. I finished the route in the usual time and went home and made eggs and didn't think about it much. She seemed fine. The baby was fine. I'd been useful for about 3 minutes, and that was the end of it. That's what I thought. The next Saturday I came through the same stretch of Clover Street, and she was on the same bench. Henry was in the stroller again, awake this time, working on a plastic ring toy. She had a paper coffee cup and a small notebook open on her knee, and she was writing something in it, frowning a little at the page. She was wearing a dark green jacket this time. Her hair was still escaping whatever she'd tried to do with it. She looked up when she heard the gravel and recognized me, and something shifted in her face from concentration to a kind of tired amusement. She said, "Cal, right?" I said, "Right." She said, "He's been asking about you." I looked at Henry. Henry was chewing on the plastic ring with complete focus. I said, "I don't think that's accurate." She smiled. It happened fast, like she hadn't planned it. "He perked up when he heard your footsteps on the gravel, so I'm calling it asking." I stopped at the bench. I looked at Henry and then at her. I said, "How's the heat situation?" She exhaled through her nose. "He says he'll get someone in this week. He said that last week." She looked down at the notebook, then closed it. "I've started putting a space heater in Henry's room at night. which I know is not a great solution, but it's warmer than doing nothing. I said that landlords who don't fix heat in February in eastern Kentucky were a specific kind of problem. She said, "That's a diplomatic way to put it." We talked for a while. It wasn't one of those conversations that go somewhere particular. It moved around. She told me Henry had turned 9 months the week before. I told her I walked this route every Saturday, had for about 3 years. She said she'd started coming to this bench in January, that Henry got fussy in the apartment and the park helped, and that she'd kept coming because she'd started to feel like she owned the bench a little. I told her it was a good bench. She agreed. After maybe 20 minutes, I said I should finish the walk. She said, "Okay, have a good one." I said the same. I came back the next Saturday. I don't know exactly when it became a thing we both expected. Somewhere around the 3rd or 4th week, she started bringing 2 coffees. She'd hold one up when she saw me on the path, and I'd take it and sit on the far end of the bench, and we'd talk until Henry needed a change or got tired, and then she'd fold up whatever she was working on and pack up the stroller, and we'd walk to the park entrance together before going our separate ways. She was a billing coordinator for a home health agency, 3 days a week. Work she did partly from home so she could manage Henry's schedule. She'd moved to Harlan about 8 months before from Paintsville, which was an hour south after things ended with Henry's father. She said that plainly, the way people say things they've already decided not to be delicate about anymore. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. She had a mother in Paintsville, and one good friend from high school named Diane, who texted her pictures of her cat a lot, which she said was more helpful than it sounds. She was renting a 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a place on Mill Street, and the landlord was in fact never going to fix the heat. She asked me about the rail yard. I told her more than I expected to, about how you learn to read a piece of steel the way you'd read a face. All the small signs it gives before something goes wrong. She listened carefully. She asked if I was ever wrong about something looking okay when it wasn't. I said that was what kept me walking slowly. She thought about that for a second and said, "That's a good way to live." I had been thinking the same thing about her, without having the words for it yet. The 6th Saturday she came to the bench with Henry asleep in the stroller and a look on her face that I hadn't seen before. Not distressed, exactly, but quiet in a way that was different from her regular quiet. She handed me my coffee without saying much, and for a few minutes we just sat while a pair of kids ran past with a dog, and the mallards did their slow lap around the pond. Then she said, "My landlord gave me a notice this week. He's selling the building. We have 60 days. She said it the way you say something you've been carrying all week, something you've been fighting with in your chest. I said, 60 days is workable. She said, I know. I keep telling myself that. It's just, Henry's in a rhythm here, and the agency I work for is here, and I've been trying not to move him around more than I have to. She looked at the stroller. He's been moved enough. I didn't say anything for a second. Then I said, what does he know about the park? She looked at me. I said, I'm asking seriously. What does he know about it? She thought for a moment. He knows that bench. He knows those ducks. He gets really calm under those dogwood trees. I think he started identifying them as something safe. I said, then where you live doesn't have to change. The park's still here. She looked at me for a beat. You're saying a park bench is stability. I'm saying you're here every Saturday, and Henry knows it, and I'm here every Saturday, and Henry knows that too, and whatever address you're at in 61 days, Saturday morning can still look the same. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, that's the most specific kind thing anyone has said to me in a really long time. I didn't know what to do with that. I drank my coffee and watched the ducks. Henry woke up about 10 minutes later and made his wanting to be held sound, and she unbuckled him and settled him on her lap, and he looked over at me with the same evaluating look he always gave me. The way a man will size up a person he's not sure he trusts yet, but is considering. I held out one finger. He grabbed it. She watched this with an expression I didn't analyze at the time, but I thought about later. More than once. She found an apartment on Chestnut Street, 2 blocks from the park. She signed a lease in the second week of May, she told me on the Saturday before the move, with a kind of exhausted relief. And she said she was not going to miss the space heater in Henry's room, and I said that was understandable. I said, without thinking much about it, "You need help moving?" She looked at me for a second. I was going to ask Diane to come up. I said, "Okay." She said, "But her truck is small, and there are a few things I don't think I can." I said I had a truck. I also had the following Saturday free, if that helped. She said it would help a lot. I showed up at Mill Street at 8 in the morning with the truck, and a dolly I borrowed from Deke. Diane was already there, mid-30s, practical, with the air of a person who had moved a lot and developed opinions about how it should be done. She sized me up the way Diane apparently sized up everyone, and then she looked at the truck and said, "Good. She needs a bigger truck." We moved the furniture in about 3 hours. The new apartment was on the ground floor, which helped. There was a second bedroom, a small one, off the kitchen, that she was planning to set up for Henry, and I moved the crib and the dresser while she and Diane did the kitchen. When I came back out, Diane had made coffee in the new kitchen, and Henry was in a bouncy seat on the floor looking at everything new around him with great seriousness. I sat on the floor a couple feet from him with my coffee, while Nora and Diane did what needed doing. He looked at me. I looked at him. He made a sound that I am choosing to interpret as friendly. After Diane left in the early afternoon, Nora and I put together the changing table in Henry's room, which required a confusing set of instructions and about 45 minutes of cooperative effort that I thought was going to go badly 3 separate times. She was better at reading the diagrams than I was. I was better at getting the bolts to behave. We finished it without arguing, which felt like a moderate achievement. She made sandwiches from things that had survived the move. We ate them at the kitchen table, which had been the first thing to go into the new apartment, and the most important, because you can eat on a crate, but you can't put a baby on a crate. She said, "Thank you for today." I said, "It wasn't anything." She said, "It was a lot." I said, "The table was already here when you needed it. That's what matters." She looked at me for a second, and then at the table. That's a very rail yard way to think about furniture. I said, "Maybe." She smiled. It lasted a little longer this time than the ones before. Henry, from his bouncy seat, expressed an opinion about something. We both looked at him. He had apparently decided the opinion didn't need elaboration and went back to studying his hands. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't making a plan. I know how these things look from the outside. The truck. The Saturday mornings, the way I had apparently memorized how long it took Henry to decide if someone was trustworthy. From the outside, it might look deliberate. It wasn't. It was just what kept happening, and I kept letting it happen. Because the Saturday mornings had become the thing the rest of my week had started to organize itself around, and I had not yet decided whether that was information I needed to do something with. What I knew, by the time she'd been in the Chestnut Street apartment 3 weeks, was this. I knew what coffee she took. I knew that Henry went down best at 7:30 and woke up around 5:45, which I knew because she texted me about it sometimes the way you tell someone a small news item about a person they know. I knew her laugh, not the polite one, the real one, which was slightly louder than she intended, and happened when something caught her off guard. I knew she was good at her work and careful about money, and that she called her mother in Paintsville every Sunday at noon. I knew she had been through something harder than 60-day notices and space heaters, something she carried in her shoulders and had decided not to put down in front of me yet. I knew she was not looking for anything from me, which I respected. I had started to suspect I was not as okay with that as I had believed. My friend Deke, who works dispatch and has an opinion about everything, said to me one Thursday, when I mentioned the move and the changing table and the sandwiches, "Cal, you understand what you're doing, right?" I said I was helping a person move. Deke said, "Sure you are." I told him to mind his yard. He said, "When she finally looks at you the way you look at her, you're going to have to actually say something. Just so you know." I drove home and didn't think about it, except that I thought about it all the way home. The last Saturday of May started the same as every other one. I came through the park, she was on the bench, Henry was awake, and in a mood to examine everything around him with extreme scientific suspicion. She handed me my coffee. The dogwoods had gone over by then, the white gone brown, the trees back to just being trees. She had a look on her face I hadn't seen before, the quiet one, but with something underneath it. I sat down and she was looking at the pond, not at me. I waited. She said, "I got a call yesterday from Nathan." I said, "Okay." She said, "Henry's dad." She said it without any particular weight, just placing the information. "He's in Lexington now. He says he wants to be involved. He's been saying that for about 4 months, which is about as long as he's been involved in not being involved." She turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. I don't know if I believe him. I don't know if believing him would be good for Henry, or just good for me in some way I'm not being honest about. She wasn't asking me a question. She was thinking out loud. I said, "What does believing him cost you?" She looked at me. I said, "If it turns out he means it, and Henry has his father in his life, what's the loss for you? And if he doesn't mean it and you find that out, what's different than what you're already doing?" She was quiet for a minute. "You're saying I should give him a chance." I said, "I'm saying the risk math might be different than it feels right now." She looked back at the pond. "You're very careful about the downside." I said, "It's what I do at the yard. Look for the failure before it happens. But sometimes the inspection comes back clean, and the thing is actually okay." She turned and looked at me for a moment. Something moved through her face. Something I could not read exactly, and I've thought about it 100 times since. Like she was seeing 2 things at once. She said, "Nathan doesn't know what he's missing." I didn't understand exactly what she meant, and I was about to say something when Henry, who had been working up to it for the last 30 seconds, reached sideways out of the stroller with one outstretched arm and grabbed 2 of my fingers in his fist and held on. She watched this. She said, quietly, "He's been doing that since the first day." She looked up at me. "Grabbing for you before you're in range." I didn't say anything. I looked down at Henry, who was pulling my fingers toward his mouth to investigate them. She said, "I don't want to say something that makes Saturday mornings weird." I said, "It's hard to make a rail yard man weird." She almost laughed. And then she said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes, "I think I was hoping you'd keep being here. Past the park. I think I've been hoping that for a while, and I've been trying to decide if I was allowed to hope it." I said, "You're allowed." Henry released my fingers and went back to his toys. We sat there for another half hour, and we didn't say anything else about it, and we didn't need to. The thing that almost broke it was not dramatic. I want to be accurate about that, because these things rarely are. It was a Wednesday evening in early June. I was on the back step when my phone lit up with a number I didn't know. And the man on the phone told me his name was David Marsh, that he was the director of operations for a freight contractor out of Lexington, and that they were taking over the Southern Yard contract at the end of the quarter. Which meant, he said this pleasantly, in the tone of a man who makes these calls regularly, that most of the current maintenance staff would be transitioned out. My position was one of them. He said I was welcome to apply for roles with the new contractor. He said it in a way that suggested he did not think I would. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat on the back step for a long time. The yard was the job I'd had for 6 years. It was the thing I walked into at 5:45 in the morning and understood completely. Every rail joint, every coupling pin, every crack that needed watching. It was the most certain thing in my life, and I had not known that until the moment it wasn't. I didn't call Nora that night. I called my mother, who told me I'd land on my feet, which was something she'd been telling me since I was 8 years old, and I believe she means it. But it's not what you need to hear at 9:30 on a Wednesday when the most solid thing in your life has just turned to loose rail. The next Saturday I walked the route to the park, and I was going to say nothing about it because it was not her problem, and I was not the kind of person who made his problems other people's burden. She knew something was wrong before I sat down. She looked at me when I took the coffee and said, "What happened?" I said nothing, it was fine. She said, "Cal." Just my name. That's all. Said in a way that meant, I'm not going to pretend you're fine, and I don't expect you to pretend it either. I told her about the call. She listened. She didn't offer solutions or reassurances. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How bad is it?" I said it depended on what they were offering, and how fast I could figure out what came next. I said I'd been looking at a few things, including a maintenance supervisor position with the county that I'd mostly been talking myself out of for 2 years because the pay was lower. She said, "Why were you talking yourself out of it?" I said because the rail yard was what I knew. She said, "Is that the real reason?" I looked at her. She said, "Or is it that you've been okay, and okay has been enough and anything different felt like a gamble?" The mallards were doing their lap around the pond. Henry was asleep in the stroller. I said, "That's probably the real reason." She said, "Apply for the county job." I said, "You sound certain." She said, "I've watched you read that park for 6 months. You see every broken thing before it breaks. That's not a rail yard skill. That's a you skill." She looked at me steadily. Apply for the job. I applied for the job. I want to tell you that was a small moment, just a practical conversation on a bench, but it wasn't. It was the first time in a long time that someone who knew me said a thing about me that I recognized as true, and said it plainly, without softening it or qualifying it, the way you say something when you mean it all the way through. The problem with Nathan was not that he came. It was how he came. He drove up from Lexington on a Thursday evening in June without calling first, which Nora had told him twice was not workable, and he rang the buzzer at the Chestnut Street apartment at 6:30 when she was in the middle of getting Henry down. She answered on the intercom, and I know what she said because she told me about it the next day. But the short version is that she told him this wasn't the arrangement, and he needed to call first. He didn't leave. He rang the buzzer twice more, and then, and this is the part she wasn't entirely calm about, when she told me, he started knocking, loudly enough that her neighbor came to the door to check what was happening. The neighbor happened to be coming in from a walk and passed him in the vestibule. I'm not going to describe Nathan at length, because he doesn't deserve the paragraph. What I will tell you is that he was the kind of man who believes his own sincerity in the moment he feels it, and has not learned that sincerity in the moment is not the same as reliability over time. He wanted Henry because he had decided he wanted Henry. The question of whether Henry needed him was not part of the calculation. He came back the next evening. I know because Nora called me. She didn't call me in distress. She called me in the flat, careful voice of a person who is managing a situation and making calls on a list. She said Nathan was outside the building again, and she'd already called her mother, and she was not scared, exactly, but she would appreciate. She said she would appreciate, in that specific word, if I wasn't on the other side of town. I was in my truck in 4 minutes. When I got to Chestnut Street, Nathan was in the vestibule with his hands in his jacket pockets, and Nora was standing in the interior doorway with Henry on her hip, and the expression on her face was one I had not seen before. Not afraid, not angry. Something more precise than both. The expression of a person who has been through enough that they have stopped being surprised by disappointment and are simply done. He saw me and recalibrated, the way men like him do, folding what he'd been about to say into a different posture. He said pleasantly, "Who's this?" I said, "Cal." He said, "You her boyfriend?" I said, "I'm her neighbor," which was close enough to true. She asked me to come over. He looked at me the way men who are used to getting their way look at men who are not moving. Then he looked back at Nora. He said, "I just want to see him. I'm not here to cause problems." Nora said, "You've come to my door twice without calling. That's the arrangement we discussed. Nathan, you call first." That was the whole thing. He said, "I was in the area," she said. "Nathan." And then she waited. He talked for a while after that, and she let him talk, and when he was done, she said, without volume, without performance, just with the absolute clarity of a person who has thought this through very carefully, "I want Henry to know his father. I've told you that. What I will not do is teach Henry that showing up without being asked and not taking no for an answer is how you treat people. So you can call me on Sunday, and we can talk about how to set up a real schedule. But tonight, I'm going to put him to bed, and I need you to go." There was a long pause. He looked at Henry, who was watching him from Nora's hip with the serious, evaluating gaze he gave everything he hadn't decided about yet. Then he looked at me. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He left. Nora stood in the doorway for a moment after he was gone, and then she let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep. And she looked down at Henry, who reached up and touched her chin. She looked up at me. She said, "Thank you for coming." I said she could have handled it without me. She said, "I know." A pause. That's not why I called. We sat on her front step for a while after Henry was down, in the warm June dark, with the sound of the street coming from a block over. She had a glass of water. I had nothing. After a while I said, "I have been carrying something for a while, and I don't know how to say it without making it into a bigger thing than maybe you need right now." She said, "Try anyway." I said those Saturday mornings were the thing I looked forward to all week. Have been since February. I didn't call it anything because I wasn't sure I had a right to, and I didn't want to make a thing out of a bench and 2 coffees and a baby who grabs my fingers. I stopped. But I think it is a thing. For me. And I wanted you to know that I know it is, and that I'm not going to say it and then disappear. I know how to show up. The yard taught me that, if nothing else. She was quiet. Then she said, "I figured something out about you in about the 3rd or 4th week." I waited. She said, "You walk that route alone, and then you go home alone and you call yourself okay." And I thought, This man has been okay for so long, he stopped knowing how to want more than okay. She looked at the street. I recognized it, because I'd done the same thing. She said, "I started bringing 2 coffees before you ever did anything worth thanking you for. I brought them because I wanted an excuse for you to sit down." The street was quiet. She said, "Henry cried, you know, that first day after you left." I said, "He was probably tired." She said, "He'd been around 10 people that week, Cal. He didn't cry when any of them left." A pause. I thought about that for 4 days. I looked at her. She said, "I'm not asking you to be Henry's father. He has a father, and we're going to figure that out. I'm just telling you that my son has been trying to tell me something about you since March, and I think I should probably listen to him." I said, "He's very smart for 9 months." She said, 10 months now. I said, "Right." She looked at me for a moment. That look. The one I'd been trying to read for weeks. The one that saw 2 things at once. And then she leaned across the step and kissed me. Brief and warm and certain. Not hesitant. Nora doesn't do anything hesitant. She makes decisions and then she makes them completely. She pulled back and looked at me. She said, "Okay?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Good." We sat on the step until it got late, talking about nothing important. And the street was quiet, and the summer was just starting, and it felt like something that had been out of alignment for a long time had finally been set back into place. Not dramatically, not with any noise, just settled. The way a thing settles when it's finally where it belongs. The county job came through in August. Road and bridge infrastructure, maintenance coordination, roughly the same skill set pointed at different materials. On my first walk of the new route, I found 3 things that needed watching before they became something worse, which my supervisor told me was good work, and which I thought was just Tuesday. Nathan calls on Sundays now. Nora answered the phone the 3rd time with Henry in her lap, and when Henry heard his father's voice, he went still with a kind of concentrated attention, like he was trying to file it somewhere. She is patient with it. She is patient with most things, in the way of a person who knows that most things take longer than you want them to, and has decided to let them. Henry walks now, short distances, with a lot of falling and reassessment. He finds it deeply interesting, which is the correct way to find it. Saturday mornings are still Saturday mornings. Same bench, same ducks, same gravel path through the park. She still brings 2 coffees. I still walk the same route. Sometimes Henry walks part of it himself, which takes about 4 times as long as it used to. And neither of us is in any hurry. My mother came up in September and stayed 4 days, and by the end of the first afternoon she had formed firm opinions about the county road department, Nathan's choices, and Henry's character, and she decided that Nora was the kind of person who would do. I told her that was high praise from her. She said it was the highest she had. Last Saturday, coming through the park, Henry heard me on the gravel before I was in sight of the bench. Nora told me this afterward. She'd seen him go alert and start to stand up in the grass, the way he does when he recognizes something coming. By the time I came around the curve, he was upright and reaching. I picked him up and he grabbed my collar with both fists and looked at me with that serious evaluating look, the one that's been the same since March. I said, "I know, I'm here." He said something that was not quite a word yet, but had the shape of one. She was watching from the bench with her coffee in both hands, in the early light, and I thought, this is the thing that was missing from the walk. Not a destination, not an arrival, just this. Someone who left a light on, who brought the extra coffee, who knew you were coming before you got there. I had spent a long time getting good at okay. I am glad I eventually let it become more.